So the reason the industrial, I'm just playing with you guys. Welcome back to another episode of Different Means here with James Gillespie and Sae'Von Springer. And this really is a companion episode to the other Live It episode that we did. And in that one, you know, I'll take the burden there. James asked me an open-ended question, and boy, did I answer it open-endedly. And so it wound up being a lot more focused on the industrial farming and agriculture phenomena that we're experiencing and the sustainability or lack thereof of that system versus things such as conscientious hunting and gathering, that sort of thing. So anyhow, definitely check that one out if you have not already listened to it. But in this episode, we're going to stay a lot more high level and go more broad strokes and give more actionable details and suggestions and thoughts on how to create a Live It that works best for you, some of the pros, some of the cons, of things to keep in mind. So, James, go ahead, kick it off for us, brother.
Okay, so Live It being what people commonly refer to as a diet, and we're referring to it as a Live It because, honestly, I mean, phonetically and otherwise, it makes more sense for you to want to be living and for it to stay alive. But essentially, it's a lifestyle. It's not something, we're not talking about fads. We're not talking about 2-week benders and then trying to, 48-hour detox with that juice that I talked about last time. We're talking about the high-level things that you need to understand about your relationship with food and the way that it's going to fuel you and what have you there. So I want to start with, before we even talk about food, let's talk about hydration. Okay, if you are not hydrated, you will overeat. If you are not hydrated, your performance will suffer. It will suffer, like we talked about in the Way of the Superior Man episode, in the bedroom. It will also suffer in the gym. It will also suffer in your day-to-day, even if you're being sedentary. If you are dehydrated, you will have more aches and pains. You will have more immobility problems because things will tighten down, and that's your body's way of saying, we're going to protect. Mm-hmm. If you're not going to give us water, we're going to protect what we need to make sure that you don't get injured. You get dehydrated in a few places. First, water is super important. Without it, you can go a lot longer without food than you can without water. So if you're going to cut out anything, cut out food, not water. But hydration, it looks different for everybody. It looks different based on your activity level, and a lot of times I think that's where people get in a little bit of a sticky situation there, right? Because you get into the place where you start drinking performance drinks, quote unquote, Gatorade, Powerade, any kind of electrolyte, any powders, anything like that that are things that are supposed to be reserved for those that are expending high numbers of calories and sweating a lot as they're dumping the salt out of their body, and they're dumping. You need to replenish with electrolytes. So hydration is the first thing before anything that you need. Also, and Sae'Von, I want you to go down a little bit about some different macro breakdowns, but macros are also another great place to start. Once you know about hydration, you have a plan forward with hydration. Food, not all food is created equal. Not all nutrients are created with the same density. You want to break it down for us a little bit? Macros, just broad strokes.
Broad stroke. I got you. So, amazing point about the hydration. Do not sleep on that. Literally, hydration, if you stay hydrated, so many things will change in your life for the better. It's crazy. So, macros, you have fats, you got proteins, and you have carbs, right? And so everything falls into one of those categories, and nothing, for the most part, is only one macro. It's going to be dominantly one thing. For instance, you could take something like peanut butter. Would somebody call that a fat or protein, right? Even though there's also some carbohydrate content. Boom, this is real life. So in terms of that macro profile, you just want to make sure you're getting a balance of it. If you want to be I'm not as hip to what some people would recommend on what that split is, but usually people are going to recommend you get a certain amount of protein, gram per body weight. That's one way to measure it. But it's similarly to the water thing. All of these are very much flexible based on your activity level. Just like you can be dehydrated, and you can have too much hydration where that causes another problem. You can undereat or be undernourished, and then you can take in too many of a particular macro, which will cause its own problems. You have too much fat, that's going to cause an issue. Too much protein, that can cause an issue. Too much carbohydrate, that causes another problem. So it's all about really identifying what's going to be the best for your body and your exertion levels, and keep it G with yourself about your exertion levels. Some of the folks out here, they're taking 2 scoops of this mass gainer whey protein every day. And you probably don't need that, homie. You probably ain't going that hard, so don't be surprised when you start looking like a marshmallow, because that excess protein that you did not excrete gets stored as fat because your body didn't need it, didn't use it. So just a little example. Sometimes less is more.
Yeah, and with that, I think a lot of people have shitty relationships with food. So you talk about macro breakdowns. Let's also look at it from the other perspective. Macros are very important when you're trying to understand how you can be properly nourished and in a tracking scenario. If you're trying to track something because you're trying to hit certain goals, you're trying to take in X amount of protein, or you've been instructed by your dietitian or nutritionist or doctor. MDs don't really know tons about nutrition, wouldn't listen to them there. If you're listening to some sort of practitioner that's instructing that you take X amount for X goal, X amount for A goal based on something that you're trying to hit, that is why the macro breakdowns they're on the packages of everything. You have the caloric, you have the ability to track your caloric intake using something like MyFitnessPal or the Precision Nutrition app or what have you. But that is very important to have an understanding of how your foods are made up, right? The foods that you're ingesting and being able to track that. But if you're not there yet, tracking macros can be a daunting task, and it can also be almost an anal retentive task. And it can also be very frustrating because you find that things that you thought were one way in nutrient profile, they're not. Mm-hmm. But just the same, and I know that there's some individuals that will come for our throats on this because they say, you shouldn't track anything, you should just intuitive eat. Intuitive eating is a thing for somebody that understands nutrition. You also do not have to track anything. You really don't if you don't want to. But having an understanding of what goes into foods and what is good for the body in this quantity versus this quantity versus that quantity is an important thing to understand. But let's back up a little bit. And if you're not going to go the route of macros, because for a lot of people, it brings a lot of stress. Yeah. Bodybuilders track macros. Not even a lot of CrossFit athletes track macros because of the amount of cardio that they're doing. Mm-hmm. People that are trying to go for physique goals, NPC, I think it's IBBF, the bikini competitors and what have you, and the bodybuilding community, they track macros. A lot of people, when you get put on dietary plans to lose X amount of weight over a certain amount of time, it's based on your TDEE, total daily energy expenditure. Yeah, and then also what you're putting in. But let's slide over from there. Before you start tracking macros, you might want to just look at some whole foods. Whole foods are something that if you're going to McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Taco Bell, Chili's, you're going to Applebee's for your first date, you're going to the steakhouse, you're probably not going to hit as many whole foods as you think you are. Yeah. Because the majority of where that stuff is sourced is from a place that's industrialized and commercialized, and that's how they're able to get it at such a cost to then put it in your food to sell it to you at the price point where it's not daunting for your pocketbook. Mm-hmm. If you're eating meat and you can get away with eating meat inside of a restaurant for $15, that same amount of meat that if you were to get somewhere else, but it was sourced differently, is 7x the price, it might say something about the quality of that. And that quality comes back down to how it was raised, what was pumped into it, what was left out of it, what kind of life it lived, how expensive is it to raise and transport. Understanding what's in your food, and there's a lot of things that we can go into too outside of this about plastic leaching, about,
gets deep, man.
Yeah, poison in the water and in food and what have you. But start with whole foods. If you're going to communicate to everybody what whole foods are, layman's terms, they are.
Yeah, so layman's terms, all a whole food is it's the source. It's how anything else that is created is a derivative of whole foods. Whole food is the food in its natural condition. So if somebody likes to eat Lay's potato chips, right, that potato chip initially was a potato. If you just eat that potato, that is a whole food. Versus the potato chip, which is a derivative, it is a processed version of that initial whole food. And so in that processing, a lot of the nutrition is ripped out. Part of that is based on the nutrient loss from cooking it, preparing it in different ways. And then some of it is a nutritional trade-off because they inject oils and other things that weren't naturally in that whole food, but they just used it as a basic substrate to then, Frankenstein the rest of it to then create a product that can stay shelf stable for months or years at a time, which nothing that is a whole food can stay shelf stable that long. Let's think about it. Food has to grow. So it at max really can last about as long as the growing season in a lot of instances, unless you really design something to take care of it. So the first ingredient, so any fruits that you see in their natural condition is a whole food. Any tubers, grains, that sort of thing are whole foods. But even something like grains where it can get a little bit tricky on, was it processed, was it bleached, and then sometimes so there's a difference between just plain old white rice and white bread versus when you can go to your local bakery and they may have a bread that's really just water mixed with some flour that came directly from some sort of wheat or grain that was grown locally that then they just milled down and ground it up into flour, or they use almond flour or something like that. Mm-hmm. So there's still ways to get in foods that you like eating in a way that is much more baseline whole food centric. And some people like to use guidelines like the Whole30. But what I would recommend for people is the easiest way to kind of make that hurdle is when you go grocery shopping, do your damnedest to only buy whole foods to start with. And then, you don't have to make your life miserable. At the very end, then maybe grab yourself a few things that are very convenient to have, that you like to have, but are not needs to have. Because if you can make that change from that habitual standpoint where the foods you're eating, by default, you opt to start making food, which means you may need to prepare several whole foods together to get your end result meal. That's going to put you in a baseline, far better place where you're not having to be as worried about counting your macros, looking at the nutritional labels because, what's in this sweet potato? Sweet potato. What's in this tomato? Tomato. You know what I mean? Versus, maltodextrin and this, that, and the third, and then you get to that, meme about shit you can't pronounce. That's not a whole food. You can pronounce any whole food unless it's just, the name of dragon fruit in a different language, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got whole foods, we've got hydration, and we've got sort of sourcing. Down that fourth thing.
So with the sourcing, ultimately you want to minimize the time between harvest and consumption because you're going to be able to capture the greatest amount of nutrition availability within that item itself. Because just like anything, it's living when it's connected to the thing that feeds it its life, right? And so when a plant is in the ground or on a tree, it is still getting its nutrition pulling from the roots of that thing. Once it is harvested and pulled from that body, it is now beginning a ticking clock that goes from a point of maybe if they if they picked it a little underripe, which is what a lot of these people have to do so that it can swing its time, try to achieve a level of ripeness, and then it goes and it wanes once more and it starts to break down. But if you can minimize that time between harvest and consumption, you're going to be able to capture the greatest bioavailability of the nutrition that's in that. So that means finding a local farmer's market, if you can, in your area. And there's almost certainly, if you live in the modern world, even more so probably in some of these, under or less developed nations, you can find yourself a farmer's market. Just Google it, go to your city's website, and they'll often actually tell you if there's a farmer's market there. And then that's going to be a really great way to find people locally who are growing a lot of these foods that you can get, which are going to be a far better alternative nutritionally and often even price-wise versus going to a place like Publix who's going to tax you for some, number 3, 4, 7, 8, 2, 3, 9, whatever GMO'd out the wazoo ass food that then is also covered in these crazy things. So you want to do that, which is also going to have another second order benefit of supporting your local economy and keeping the money circulating in that environment versus sending it off to one of these conglomerates that's then going to send it out of the country to some other conglomerate holding company and that whole cycle there. So it's an easy way to stay tapped in with the community, get more nutritionally available food, and also save a little bit of money if you can source it as locally as you can. And if you can't do that, find grocery stores that try to do that, like Sprouts. Trader Joe's tries to do that to the best of their ability. But it's just really about being an informed consumer. Do you want to eat a tomato that came from California? If you could get one that came from Georgia, if you're in Georgia, I would just think logically somebody could see the value in that versus getting the thing that sat on a truck, for 2, 3, 4, 5 days, maybe longer. Even from a sanitation standpoint, like, where was this truck sitting? Anyhow.
Okay, so for those out there that all of that is too deep, everything we just went into, because it is I call it privilege, call it whatever. We have spent time going down the path of research enough to understand that the things that we're saying truly do matter when you have an understanding of nutrition. What about for the people that right now are just eating out? Yeah. They're just, their significant other putting food in front of them. Mm-hmm. They don't know where it's from. They like it. It tastes good. Maybe they're not in a position that they'd like to be with their body composition. Maybe they're not someone that habitually works out, so that's not a habit. And because that's not a habit, they see what happens the more that they're eating. But they don't really know where to start. I mean, most people that are commuting back and forth all over the place are eating out 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 times a week. Like, not cooking at home, right? Where does somebody start? The person that asked us to talk about diet in the first place is somebody that has just got up and disappeared from the United States and has jumped into a completely new place, doesn't know the local culture, doesn't know the local food. When he was here, cooked for himself all the time, made it a point because of the things that you're saying, but is in a new place. Where do you start?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think you have to start with the end in mind. If you can be firm enough on the justification and the rationale behind making that transition, then that can put you in a good place. Example, some people want to reduce the amount of out to eat, trips that they do eating out from a financial standpoint because they're spending too much money. But what if you have all the money in the world, then you don't care about the fact that it's more expensive to do that. So then you need to have a deeper reason behind it. So then if health becomes the reason, then you actually recognize that sometimes it's not really the eating out that's the problem. It's what is more readily available to you. There are hundreds more McDonald's than there are places like True Food Kitchen.
Or Upbeat.
Right? Like
Upbeat
I'll go to Upbeat 7 days a week. Why? Because they have built themselves on the same principles we're talking about. They source everything as locally as they can. It's literally all whole foods. You pick if you want kale, if you want chard, if you want spinach, and then you choose your grains. But obviously that's so much harder to do, so they can't put them up in every zip code the way they can do with a Waffle House. So I think if somebody starts with really knowing why they want to make that transition, that can be the anchor point that shows them the way. Because if you are tremendously busy busy and money's not a problem, then you can start to consider other options like even maybe getting a caterer or a chef
prep.
or something.
Yeah.
Meal prep services. I was going to say the things like the Purple Carrots or the Hello Fresh or this, that, and the third.
Blue Apron, where then you can cook it, or the butcher boxes.
There's so many options. Yeah, butcher boxes. That's
one
a
of the
great
places.
point.
Yeah, where they take the where it's meat that's not.
Yep.
It's intentionally non-industrialized meat. It is small farms. It is locally sourced within X amount of miles of where they're delivering it from.
Yep.
And it's animals that lived life out.
A full, happy life until that last moment.
Yeah, I mean, now you're paying for it. You know,
Exactly.
you're definitely monetarily paying for it. But again, if that's not something that you're worried about, but you'd still like that meat, on our former episode, you need to go listen to it. But if you'd still like that meat, that's a great place to go too. I find that sometimes the time suck for me of cooking. I'm like, there ain't no way. So I could spend $10 and get to the place that Upbeat could get me for $25, but the time spent preparing all the things in the manner that they would to get that same amount of time spending eating, sometimes it's just worth I'll just take the bowl for $20. You know,
sure.
We'll keep it moving.
And that's why those goals matter, because ultimately people just need to know that there are options. You know what I mean? Like even people who want to eat better, but they don't want to make the full leap to locally sourced, organic, grown, all this other stuff, and you're cooking every single night. There are these intermediate steps that can be done. Even somebody who eats at a McDonald's or something, even though both of you and I advise against that, if you can help it, there are better choices on that menu than others. Something simple. People, you can get the chicken sandwich fried, or you can get it grilled.
The grilled chicken sandwich is a whole lot better than the double Big Mac.
You know, so it's like...
From a nutrient profile.
From a nutrient profile standpoint.
If you have to have something there, if you're not... in a lot of ways, you have free will regardless. But if you don't have another viable option in the time constraint that you're in and you're faced with the McDonald's menu, it is much more advisable to go with the McChicken, the grilled chicken sandwich, than it is to go with a Big Mac.
Yeah. And there's just, and starting to think in that way, it does require reprogramming of sorts. You know, I grew up where literally even in high school, I would sometimes for dinner eat multiple bowls of cereal. One, because financially, that's what the hell we had. And it was a convenience standpoint. It was just so much. And,
I did that shit all the time.
If you don't know any better, they're like, whoa, you're literally finna eat these hollow ass calories, all this fake sugar, you know, all of this other dyes and all this crazy stuff in it. But if you don't know any better and you're not really aware of the options and you're constrained in all these different ways, that's why it really takes putting that goal out in front. And if that goal is I want to be health conscious, or I want to save money, or I want to support my local environment, everybody's justification is going to be different, but really hone in on that. And then it makes it easier to work backwards and find the solutions that can remedy that particular problem you find yourself hoping to solve. So, I mean, we can't really make a one-size-fits-all recommendation, which is why we're throwing out these scattershot options.
I think maybe this is potentially closer to more applicable to the more people listening to this. What about for the right out of college, the 22 to 28 that doesn't have oodles of cash to go spend on Butcher Box, Blue Apron, HelloFresh, what have you, wants to eat more sustainably, doesn't have a lot of time? I mean, like, let's go ahead and add in all the environmental factors here for somebody in their mid-20s, still also trying to date. You know, you talk about alcohol, you talk about whoa, what is a 25 or 26-year-old man or woman that's out of college, that's in their first job, that's trying to have a social life, do about food that doesn't make $200,000?
Yeah. I think one of the best places you can start, and in my opinion, you can't really skip this step, because if you graduated college, you've demonstrated, ideally, you're not a dumbass. So create a budget. Right? Not that having a degree means you're intelligent, but you shouldn't be a dumbass if you got out of there. So create a budget, right? And I know a lot of people that's like, oh my God, like that's daunting. But similarly with counting macros, it doesn't mean you have to become a slave to the budget, but the budget can provide you a degree of freedom. Because when you create that budget, you need to figure out what it would cost you. And you can do it a couple of ways. You can just track how much you spend when you just, free willy it. And then you can see how different it is when you build in some constraints. Whether that constraint is I can only eat out once a day, or I have a budget of $100 a week to eat out if you're a particularly commuting type of individual. But in addition to doing those things, I think it's very necessary to settle on a few different go-to things you feel confident making. And they can be simple. Like me, by God, literally oatmeal and smoothies have gotten me by for years, dog. Because it's like I can make a hell of a smoothie and I make the best oatmeal you've ever had in your life. And so having those two dishes make it so that if I'm in a pinch, I know I can do those two things.
You've got something. You don't have to go drop oodles of cash, and you don't also have to then go sacrifice something that you've been on the path of.
Yeah.
And go get something super processed, even if it is plant-based in your situation. You don't have to go do that because...
Yeah, there's options. And for everybody, like you can find things that are unique to you. I would recommend get yourself a rice cooker, right? Because unless you're one of those people who really swears that you should never touch a grain, that's on you. Maybe go read some more research papers, but grains are not going to end your life or make you foggy brained or whatever. But just get tools is all I'm getting at that can make the process easier for you. So for me, that meant going out and getting a rice cooker so that I'm less likely to run to the Jamaican spot to get, the plantains and the rice and the piece of cocoa bread. And so that it's easy for me where I can just wash some rice off, throw it in there, throw some quinoa in there, go take a shower after workout, whatever, come back, the rice is done. Now I can also steam my broccoli on top of that. Or all I have to do at that point is saute something real quick, throw it together, then you throw some flavor on it, and boom, you have yourself a little meal. So for some people, it's a crock pot. For some people, it's a wok. You know what I mean? For some folks, it's a toaster oven. But get yourself a couple of things that are going to make the cooking experience more enjoyable. So for some people, that means getting a good set of knives. Shout out Cutco. If I was still selling them, I'd be plugging them even harder. But get things that will make that a more fluid process for you, so that when you do need to stay at home, whether it's because you got something you need to get done and the place you used to go to is already closed, or you're on that budget end of the month where you need to save that money, it just keeps those barriers low so that it is easy for you to get into the flow and make something for yourself, whether that's, a George Foreman so you can make chicken breasts really fast. Like, there's so many options for you that can make it easier, because guess what? These restaurants, they have things and they've invested to make it way faster to make these foods. And if they can make something that's this incredible dish for you in 20 minutes time, when they're also trying to make 20 other meals for people, it's probably a reality that you could also make that meal just as fast if you just practiced it a couple of times. Yeah.
So that's about the conclusion of the time we have for this episode today. I think we both do, that you took something from this episode, and it is a start. We will be back again at some point about livets and diets and probably plastic leaching and a couple other things. But another day. We appreciate y'all coming out, and we will see you next time. Don't forget, everything is on YouTube. You will see our shining faces over there. Tons of snippets. Thank y'all for coming out.
Thank y'all. Peace.